Introduction, and to the ACDH for giving me this opportunity to share with you what has really been what I think is one of the most influential and also exciting projects that I've worked on as a researcher. When I was thinking about what to title this talk, I really titled it as a nod to my humanities colleague, Kate Coles, who a few years ago gave a talk at a digital humanities conference where she reflected on our collaboration and the ways that in which it influenced her as a poetry scholar. And so today I want to do something very similar, which is I want to talk about the work that I've done with humanists and talk about how it's really inspired and exposed some, what I think are some really interesting insights into the way that we conduct research as visualization designers. So the insights that I want to share with you today are grounded in a digital humanities project that I had the pleasure of working on with a really stellar cast of researchers and scholars at the University of Utah. So on the left, Kate Coles and Julie Lean are poets and poetry scholars from the Department of English at the University of Utah. Kate is actually, she's a particularly accomplished poet in the US, having published 8 books, and serving as the 3rd poet laureate for the state of Utah. Then there's Nina McCurdy, who is a computer science PhD student working in my research group back at Utah. And our group, which we call the Visualization Design Lab, takes an applied approach to visualization research. And what that means is we collaborate with experts in a very broad range of academic fields. We design visualization solutions to the real-world data analysis challenges that they have. And then as visualization researchers, we use these collaborations as a test bed in order to motivate and be able to ask much deeper research questions about visualization, about data science, and also just about computer science more generally. Do you want me to step back? Okay, talk quieter. So in the project I want to share with you, we explored how visualization might impact the close reading of poetry. So in a close reading of a poem, a poet deeply explores a single text, analyzing possible themes and poetic devices for how they interact to form complex meaning. Here I'm showing you a close reading that we recorded of Kate.
Your brittle nature. Nature is really interesting. Is that body or is that soul? It's right in the same position as soul, right? But it sure feels more material to me, right? And then here you get again this tension between the physical and the ethereal, the non-physical. Prepares your brittle nature, and brittleness, by the way, is very dangerous because a tap, right? A tap can shatter it, and we get that here. And by the way, tell me that blow and soul aren't rhyming like crazy in this poem. Prepares your brittle nature.
So Kate and Julie were really interested in how computation and visualization more specifically could augment, impact, and shift and shape their experience of a close reading. Although at the time that we started this project, there were existing tools for close reading, the true value of technology was and still is very much an open question. At the start of this collaboration, Kate and Julie posed this specific question to me. How might a visualization affect the aesthetic experience of a close reading of a poem? Now, to be completely honest, as a computer scientist without a whole lot of knowledge about poetry, this question literally blew my mind. And it took me probably about 1.5 years of discussions with these poets to even begin to unpack what they might mean. So to tackle thinking about this question, Nina and I employed a visualization research methodology called design study. Design study is a methodology that really is grounded in an applied type of computer science work. What it is it's a project where we analyze some sort of real-world problem that real living, breathing people out there in the world have. We design a visualization solution to support that problem. We deploy the tools in order to validate these designs in the wild. And then at the end, come back and reflect about the lessons that we've learned along the way in order to bring knowledge back to the visualization community. Now, as an approach to research, design study pulls from both design research processes and the qualitative research approaches. And so from the design side, the sort of core bit of a design study looks a lot like other sort of very iterative design type of processes, where we spend some time trying to understand the way that our collaborators think about their data, the kinds of challenges they have, and the sorts of intuitions and mental models that they bring to their work. We then go and we ideate on what are good data representations to support this problem, and what are some visualization types of representations we might use to help support them in making sense of that data. We then employ a rapid prototyping approach to making prototypes. So we do all the way from quick sketches and whiteboard drawings through fully implemented software prototypes. And we deploy these in order to get feedback about their efficacy and what we can do to improve our understanding of the problem. A really important thing here is the fact that we have this evaluate step, which is about going back and getting feedback from the people that we're working with. And this happens throughout our entire process. It isn't something we do at the end. It is something that is incremental and iterative, and oftentimes leads to very much a sort of co-design process with the people we're designing for. While designing a possibly new and innovative visualization tool is often the goal, we're also really concerned with the rigor and the validity of a design study itself. And as such, we make use of methods and criteria from qualitative research practice, such as sustained and long-term engagement with our collaborators, which helps to ensure the relevance and authenticity of the work that we're producing. We rely on triangulation and saturation of the underlying data in order to support our decisions and conclusions that we come to. And then also, we rely on openness and transparency about our research process itself to help others to scrutinize the process that we've used and also potentially repeat parts of it. Now, the design study that we conducted with these poets actually lasted for about 3 years, where we started from just initial, very informal conversations until the point that we submitted an academic computer science journal paper. Now, actually, more than half of that time was spent trying to figure out what it meant to visualize a poem. We really had to tackle what was interesting as well as doable from both a poetry scholarship perspective as well as from a visualization research one. Nina and I learned from talking with Kate and Julie that poets weave together a wide range of poetic devices when writing a poem in order to shape and influence the emotional impact that a poem has on a reader. Our collaborators were interested in visualizing these devices in the context of a single poem. It turns out that computationally detecting some of these devices are open problems in computer science. One, however, really caught our eye as both computable and poetically powerful, and that was rhyme. So we went off and we developed a computational backend that would detect sets of words in a poem that are related through a variety of sonic patterns. And these patterns encompassed a very broad range of sound patterns beyond the perfect rhymes that many of us are familiar with. Using these sets of words that we could detect as our underlying data, we then visualized these sets of sonically related words in the space of the poem, while attempting to capture a feeling of flow that our poetry collaborators used over and over again to describe the evolution of sound within a poem. And it was really the intersection and the divergence of these flows that became the primary focus of our design. Nina then went and implemented this interactive tool I'm showing you here called Poemage that allowed the poets to then freely explore rhyming sets for a broad range of sonic patterns. Now, in designing Poemage, we adhered to well-established visualization guidelines and principles, such as we very carefully designed mechanisms to mitigate visual clutter in the views, and used a typical type of design pattern called a multiple view in order to support analysis of the sets of words from different perspectives on the data. Great, so we deployed this tool to our collaborators as well as several other poets, and followed up later to see what sorts of insights it would generate for them. One of the poets that we deployed the tool to used it to create erasure poems, which are a form of poetry that are generated by erasing words from an existing text, resulting in a new poem and possibly new meaning. Now, she used features of Poemage to select and erase sets of words, really guided by her own aesthetic sensibilities. Images of her erasure poems, including these two, were later exhibited in a local art gallery in Salt Lake City. In another case study, one of our poetry collaborators used Poemage to explore the poem Reading Plato. She described to us her approach to using Poemage as noodling, where she would hover over one sonic feature after another in the various views, selecting and deselecting rhyme sets almost arbitrarily. And she said that her greatest successes and insights came every case when she happened on something very indirectly, just through idle play. And she reflected on her experience in the tool in this way. The interface felt engaging and responsive, and it reflects the sensibility that I experience when reading a poem. That interpretive readings are made choice by responsive choice, and that nothing is absolutely conclusive. We wrote up our results as an academic paper, which we published in a computer science journal. And the contributions that we as computer scientists claimed in this paper included things like a rich description of the role of sound in the close reading of poetry, an interpretation of that description into a generic computational representation, and then the validated design of our tool, Poemage. We also, at the end, included a very brief discussion of some of the insights about lessons learned that we came to through reflecting on our process. When we wrote this, we really framed this work as a classic example of a design study, following the argument and evidence templates that have become very well established in the visualization research community. And yet, to me, this design study and what we learned and experienced during it felt completely different than the half dozen other design studies I had conducted prior to this one. And I should note that those prior design studies had solely been conducted with scientists. So since then, over the last couple of years, I've been able to step back and reflect on this digital humanities project as I've continued to focus on collaborative visualization design projects. And there's a couple of particularly poignant points from working with poets that have become central themes in many of the projects that I've been working on the last few years. The first one is that getting to design requirements in this project took a very, very long time. It took us a year and a half just to even begin to start to understand what might we be visualizing in a poem. 2, the poets weren't really looking for answers in using Poemage or in the data we were generating for them. They were really using the tool in a very different way in their workflow. And 3, at the end of the day, the tool was not the most important result that came out of this collaboration, either for Nina and I or for the poets themselves. It was really more about the learning that we did as scholars and researchers. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk is I'm going to reflect on each of these ideas and ground them in the Poemage project, and then talk about how some of the recent work that we've been conducting in our lab has built and extended on each one of these. Okay, so this first one, getting to design requirements, took a very long time. So in the Poemage project, it all started back in 2012 when Kate and Julie were collaborating with a couple of visualization colleagues at Oxford University on a tool that they called Poem Viewer. Now, in this work, they had been exploring the importance of sound and the feeling of words in the mouth when spoken, along with several other poetic devices. I had recently started as a new faculty member at the University of Utah, and Kate and Julie very generously looped me in to their conversations, and thus this project was born. But at the time, I knew almost nothing about poetry or digital humanities, and so what I did is I started reading through a lot of literature in order to contextualize the conversations I was having in what was going on more broadly across the DH community. It was at that point then that Kate and Julie proposed their high-level question to me, and hence, I felt like I was in La La Land. So from here, as the Poem Viewer work was wrapping up, Kate and Julie and I discussed what they had learned from the project and what types of poetic devices they found most interesting. I began to look into the natural language processing literature on algorithms for detecting different types of devices, and really honed in on sound as one that was really computationally tractable. So after implementing some basic text-to-sound algorithms, I then began experimenting with ways to visualize sets of sonically related words. It was around this time that Nina joined my research lab as a new PhD student and took over the lead and really pushed this project forward. She and I continued to conduct interviews with Kate and Julie. We read literature, and we attended public readings, all in trying to get ourselves more familiar with digital humanities and poetry scholarship. Nina refined our ideas of sonic patterns then by conducting studies with a broader network of poets to better understand the types of sound patterns they were interested in. And we were really surprised, I say that as a computer scientist, but we were really, really surprised by the diversity of these patterns. They included things like orchard and torture, nevermore, raven, star, stir, stare, and store. And then some of the more boundary-pushing and interesting ones, Britney Spears and Presbyterians, or whack-a-mole and guacamole. So this ended up informing the design of a formalism for specifying and detecting sonic patterns very generally, which Nina then implemented in a tool called rhyme design. And rhyme design was really the point that allowed us to begin experimenting in earnest as we could now datafy a poem on the fly. This really allowed us to move our conversations with Kate and Julie away from poetic devices and now more towards visual representations. This is when they began talking about the flow of a poem and the turbulence that devices caused, as they described poems as streams and brooks, and sonic devices acting as points of turbulence in the flow. Nina began experimenting with ways to work these ideas into a set visualization representation, which then ultimately led us to the core design for Poemage, which we published at the Visualization Conference a year later. So I just want to stress again, this was a 3-year exploratory, iterative process that went from initial conversations to very specific and actionable design requirements that we as computer scientists could actually design a tool for. It took us 3 years to find the intersection of interesting to poets and interesting to visualization designers. This was a very long time. But this very long process of getting to design requirements, it turns out, was not unique to this project, and is something that I've experienced over and over again in design studies. And in fact, I'd say it's really the norm to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what someone needs to do in any of these applied visualization projects. So for example, in a more recent project, a more recent design study that was led by another one of my students, Ethan Kersner, we worked with a team of neuroscientists at the University of Utah who are developing techniques to better understand the wiring diagram of the brain. They work in a really interesting field, connectomics, where they take little slices of brain, or little pieces of brain, and slice it very thin with a very high-end deli slicer. They image these slices and end up with a volume from which they can extract cells and how cells are connected to one another. So at the end of this, they have pretty straightforward data. They have a very large graph. And so while their data to us as visualization designers was fairly straightforward for us to wrap our head around, it turned out that being able to map the scientific questions that they had to graph analysis tasks proved to be very time-consuming and required getting a lot of consensus among researchers in the group. After several months of conducting interviews with one person in the group after another, Ethan was ready to try something totally different. At this point, he had come across a paper from a research group in London who had run a series of creativity workshops with energy analysts. Now, these workshops are a participatory design method for very quickly and effectively eliciting design requirements through structured brainstorming as a group. They usually last for about 1 day, and they take participants through a set of open-ended brainstorming activities. What ends up coming out of these workshops are tons and tons of ideas for interesting visualization projects that are grounded in the needs of the workshop participants themselves. Now, in this paper, this London-based visualization team described a huge range of design requirements that they learned about through their workshops. And they successfully turned these into a really nice visualization tool that the energy analysts really liked. Most compelling, though, was that these workshops took a fraction of the time of the more traditional methods like interviews and observations that we would normally use to get to design requirements. Okay, so Ethan was intrigued, as was I, so he designed and ran a workshop with the neuroscientists, and it was a complete success. He was able to uncover a very broad range of needs that this group had in just a single day, as well as to build trust, credibility, consensus, and agency with the scientists themselves. From this, Ethan was able to design and deploy a visualization tool for exploring patterns of different paths within a graph, which the scientists are using to understand how different types of neurons interact within our brains to transmit messages. Okay, great. So after this very successful experience, Ethan approached the lead author from that London group, Sarah Goodwin, just to talk about their experiences of running workshops and really try to understand what could we do better next time. These initial conversations led to a 2.5-year collaboration with the group from London, as well as myself and Ethan, where we collectively reflected on our experience of running 17 workshops in 10 different projects and on 3 different continents. The result of this collective reflection was then a formalized description of creativity workshops for visualization design that was grounded in both our experience of running these workshops as well as theories behind group creativity. Now, this description that we developed outlines the considerations for designing and conducting creativity workshops, along with a set of brainstorming activities that we have repeatedly used with success. These workshops have really become a core method that we use in our group, and we run these for almost every single project that we undertake. And I speculate that these workshops have saved us months of time on each individual project that we would have normally have spent doing traditional interviews and observations. Now, the reason, or what I think are part of the reasons why these workshops are so effective, is that it allows a team of people to come together to think very deeply and creatively about their joint challenges. It also facilitates a whole bunch of interpersonal relationship building that turns out is really vital to successful collaborations. For example, after running our workshop with the neuroscientists, the lead scientist of the group, who had been exceedingly difficult to get any time with to do interviews, agreed to a weekly meeting with Ethan as the project pushed forward, which really was a huge game changer in being able to get buy-in from the larger group. And this was because the workshop really allowed us to build trust and agency with him. Okay, getting back to digital humanities. Recently, we were really curious if these creativity workshops would be just as productive and fruitful for projects with humanists, where being creative is already a core part of their scholarship. We wondered if putting structure around a creative process would stifle ideas, or could it help mold and shape opportunities? So we recently had a chance to test this when a postdoc in my group, Pascal Goffin, ran a workshop with a music collaborator who's looking to visualize information about voice recital songs. In just a few hours, we ran a mini workshop that helped us to expose our collaborator to visualization possibilities, to develop a priority list of features that he was interested in, to distinguish between short-term goals and longer-term potential in the project, and to really collate the explosion of ideas that we had had into a nice, manageable list of things we could discuss. Now we're at the point where we're really hoping to move this project forward in a mutually beneficial design study. Okay, so this was really thinking back to this notion that getting to design requirements in the Poemage project took an exceedingly long time. But this was absolutely not unique. It's something that we've seen over and over again. And we've been able to really push on this idea and think about new and novel methods that we can employ to make the work that we do more efficient. Okay, so the second bullet. They weren't looking for answers. And by they, I mean the poets. And by answers, I mean they weren't looking for very precise, specific, countable things in a poem. They were using the visualization and the data for something else. So I want to go back briefly to one of these case studies from the Poemage work. And what I want to do is I really want to emphasize the end of this quote, where she says, interpretive readings are made choice by responsive choice, and that nothing is absolutely conclusive. What I really love about this quote is that it emphasizes both the iterative nature of her interpretive process, as well as the lack of perfect, precise answers in the data. It turns out that none of our poetry collaborators used Poemage to find precise, quantifiable things about sonic patterns in a poem. Instead, they were using the tool, as well as the data, as inspiration to support their creative research process. Now, while the nature of close reading by itself is to interpret and to brainstorm and to come up with many, many ideas, I don't think that's that different from the way that I've seen scientists also use visualization tools. And to tell you about that, we're going to look at another project that I worked on in collaboration with a lab of biologists who are studying metabolism in yeast. Now, the underlying scientific goals of this lab were to understand how genes and gene function evolves over time, which turns out to have implications for our understanding of very complex diseases like cancer. I worked with this biology lab for about a year and had the opportunity to collaborate with a really brilliant designer, Bang Wang, who specializes in scientific communication. He and I ended up designing a new tool for the lab that we called Pathline. One of the really significant advances of Pathline was how we visually represented gene expression, which is one of the core data types that this lab was working with. Now, gene expression is basically just a measure of how much a gene is turned on or off in a cell. Now, traditionally, the way the biologists would visualize and interpret gene expression is using a heat map representation like the one I'm showing you here. So in this heat map, we're actually looking at data from this biology lab. Now in this view, different genes go across the columns, and the rows are different time points and different species of yeast. Now in initial interviews with this group, they told us that they found these heat maps really, really difficult to make sense of, particularly for reasoning about the very small-scale temporal patterns that they were interested in about this gene expression. So Bang and I developed a new way to look at this data that we called a curve map. And what we did is we replaced the color encoding instead with a matrix of time curves. To validate this new encoding, when we deployed the tool, the group right away looked at 3 genes that they knew a lot about. And that was genes 5, 6, and 7. And this is where they're shown in that heat map display. So, for example, in gene 5, they knew that gene 5 behaved very differently across the different species of yeast. And you can see this very quickly in the curve map by seeing the curves that are shaped quite differently. This is in contrast to gene 7, which they knew behaved very similarly in the species, and thus resulted in very similarly shaped curves. Now, another thing that they knew about these genes was the relationships of gene 5 and gene 6. Now, they knew that these two genes perform similar function in the cell, and thus they behave similarly in the different species. And you can see this by looking across the pairs of curves and seeing that the curves look quite similar. Now, both of these insights were things that they actually already knew about the data, but they used in order to validate that this new encoding could still show them things that they knew existed. But they said that these trends had been nearly impossible to reason about in the heat map display. But then they actually saw something that they had never seen before. And that was this pairwise relationship of gene 5 and 6 in this specific species of yeast. Even after years of working with and visualizing this data, they had never noticed this mirror imaging of these time curves. And they actually had no idea why this was and what caused it. This led to them going back to the lab, designing some new experiments, and they actually discovered a previously unknown gene duplication event in the ancient history of this specific species. So, reflecting on this result, what I think is really interesting here is the role that visualization played in the lab's discovery process. The tool wasn't a source, it wasn't a source of answers for them, but rather a source of inspiration and brainstorming within their larger scientific discovery process. And if you take this perspective even a little bit further, you could even argue that the data itself is a source of inspiration for us to think creatively. And in this regard, what this lab does is they are really interested in this concept of gene evolution. This is not a concept that you can directly measure. So instead, they try to understand gene evolution by measuring something called gene expression. So here, gene expression is really a proxy for the thing that they care about. If the biologists could learn something about gene expression, they can then infer something about how the genes evolved over time. It turns out gene expression is just one type of proxy for studying evolution, and other scientific labs look at evolution through the lens of different types of proxies. Because at the end of the day, data itself is just a proxy for the things that we care about in the world. And a large part of data-driven science is about establishing what measurements are good proxies for answering the deep scientific questions that we have. So just last year, my colleague Daniela Fasching and I published a book that explores this idea of proxies and the implications for visualization design. Now, in our book, we define proxies as partial and imperfect data representations of the semantically rich, domain-specific thing that the analyst actually cares about. The high-level goals of an analyst are rarely directly captured in data. We don't often have a data attribute or a column in our spreadsheet that exactly addresses the thing we care about. And if we did, we probably wouldn't need things like visualization. But instead, as visualization designers, I've really come to understand that one of the things that we strive to do is to help the analyst find effective approximations for the thing they care about in the data that they have. So Daniela and I have developed a simple framework for helping visualization designers unpack real-world analysis goals and questions into tasks that we can actually design a tool for. And the framework focuses on identifying reasonable data proxies for these real-world goals. So I just want to give you a flavor for what that framework looks like, and I'm going to do it with a really simple goal. And let's say that I want to identify good film directors. Now, maybe I'm a student, a film student, and I have an assignment of writing a research about a really great film director. Okay, the first thing I need to do is make an informed choice. I'm going to choose to make a data-driven informed choice. So maybe I go off and I'm going to scrape a bunch of data from IMDb about movies. Okay, so now I have this great data set about movies where I have loads of information about how much money a movie has made, about the genre, I have information about who directed it, I have information about its rating from the broader community, and so on. Okay, but it turns out I don't care about movies, I care about film directors, and I can't directly address my goal with the data I have. So what I need to do is I need to identify good proxies in the data that will let me infer something about directors. So in the book that Danielle and I have, we've put together a simple framework for how we do this selection of proxies. And it looks something like this. We take a task, we want to identify first the action, which is the thing you want to do, the object, which is the items you want to take that action on, and then finally the measure, which is the value that you're actually interested in for those objects. Okay, so what does this mean for our simple example? My action is identify. And so what is it I want to identify? Film directors. Okay, so this is where I say to myself, well, I don't have a data set about film directors, I have one about movies. So I'm going to let movie be my proxy for director and hope that if I can learn something about movies, I could then infer something about directors. Now, what is it I care about directors? I care that they're good. Whew, okay, well, what does that mean? That's a highly subjective and interpretive thing. Good could mean I'm a movie that made a lot of money. It could be that I'm a movie that reached a very broad demographic of people. It could be I'm a movie that got a very high rating on IMDb. For this example, I'm going to choose high IMDb rating. But the point I want to make here is that the measures that we care about is really where a lot of the interpretation and creativity comes from. And I think this is one of this is at the heart of data science, is really figuring out what are these good measures, what are good proxies in the data, and then trying to validate those as reasonable for the questions that I have. So now that I've identified these proxies, I can then translate this task into identify movies with high IMDb ratings, which is actually something, given my data, that I could try to do. Now, I just want to quickly say, like, okay, this is great, but, you know, I'm a visualization person. Do I care about visualization? The answer is yes, and it has to do with trying to really understand and validate proxies. Maybe I come to understand that maybe high ratings is a little different from movies that are really popular, and what I really care about is popularity. So what I might do is go and create a histogram of the number of ratings that movies have. This happens to be on a log scale, and I can see down here on the far end that there's actually not a lot of movies that got a lot of ratings. Okay, so maybe I'm just going to filter my data set down to the movies that have the most ratings and look at the distribution of ratings that those movies have. And now I can see a nice distribution, and I see at the very end that there's only a small set of movies that both got lots of ratings and very high ratings. And so now I can really hone in my own analysis on those sets of movies and go on. And so it's really this iterative process of thinking deeply about what do I have in the data that could stand in for the thing I care about? How do I validate those stand-ins or those proxies? And visualization has become a really important part of that whole exploration process. Okay, so just sort of backing up again, the idea here is that what we saw in the Poemage project was that the poets weren't finding direct answers about the data we were giving them. They were doing something much more interesting. They were really being creative. And I really think that this notion of creativity and brainstorming is a huge part of what we do in any sort of data-driven field these days. Okay, and so this third point. The tool was not the most important result that came out of this. So in the journal paper that Nina and I wrote about the Poemage design study, we ended up devoting about 30% of that paper to describing the visualization tool Poemage. Okay. We described in great and gory detail the design decisions that we made, the multiple linked view design pattern we used, the specific color palette that we designed, our use of size encodings, an extensive description of the algorithm for routing lines between words, and a whole laundry list of user interactions that we implemented. In this description, we also discussed a couple of design features that we found particularly interesting. One of them is what we fondly refer to as the beautiful mess. So what this feature shows is all the rhyming sets that exist in a poem at once, resulting in what I would call significant visual clutter. And despite our protests to the poets to get rid of this feature, they kept asking for it over and over again. And luckily, Nina, who was very sensitive to what the poets wanted, insisted on it staying in, and it was definitely the right decision. So in our paper, this design feature gets a single paragraph that describes that discusses the list of options the user has for exploring sets of words. But in the middle of the paragraph is this sentence. Despite our initial hesitation to support showing all rhyme sets at once due to visual clutter, our collaborators were able to make interesting discoveries with this feature. Now, upon reflection, I think that this sentence hints at something much more interesting that was going on here. That there was a mismatch between a deeply held visualization principle, don't have visual clutter, and a user preference in the wild. And I can't help but wonder, what if we had been more attuned to this mismatch? What if we had pursued this mismatch to possibly uncover something we don't actually know about basic visualization design principles? I'd argue that our design feature itself is less interesting than what it potentially exposes about the limits of established guidelines in the visualization community. Another feature that we ended up devoting significant amount of page budget to discussing was the algorithm that we designed to reroute words, to reroute edges in a complex way. So instead of linking words with just simple curves, we instead developed a technique to curve the lines between the words in the poem. Now, in the middle of the description for the algorithm, we have this interesting sentence. In addition, the rerouting generates more organic, aesthetic curves than those generated in our previous implementations, which increase the overall efficacy of the tool for our collaborators. Now, the importance of aesthetics was stressed to us from the poets throughout the entire design process. And this points, I think, towards something potentially really interesting about the relationship of aesthetics and the designs that we create for people. Is the look and feel of a visualization important? If so, why and how? What opportunity could there have been in this project to dig more deeply into this interesting question? Now again, I'd argue that the design feature that we had is really less interesting than what it probes at about the things we don't fully understand about people's relationship with and feelings about the visualizations that we're designing for them. Now, we really struggled to write our paper, our computer science paper about Poemage, in part because we felt like we were shoehorning the very diverse learning we had acquired into a formula for describing novel visualization features, techniques, algorithms, and systems. And this formula stressed the visualization as a primary contribution, when in fact, I'd argue it was secondary to many of the other insights that we had throughout the process. And in looking back, our challenges really started long before we had started drafting the paper. And throughout the design study, we lacked the methodology to notice important moments of learning and to be able to pivot in our goals. And we also lacked a reporting structure to explain and contextualize the learning we had acquired. Which brings me to the last project I want to tell you about, which is a recent project that Nina and I worked on, and in this case, collaborating with global health experts who are looking to understand and stem the spread of the Zika virus in Latin America and its associated health risks, notably microcephaly in babies who are infected in utero. Now, this design study began with Nina conducting a 6-month field study at the USAID organization in Washington, D.C. And for us, this project had all the signs of a really straightforward design problem. The experts had data, they had tried already to visualize it and had struggled, and they were really excited to work with us on some potentially innovative ways to explore the data. During this field study, Nina developed and deployed a tool to explore Zika outbreak data, along with data about in-country programs that international organizations have in place to combat the disease. Now, the goal of the tool was to help global health experts make decisions about whether or not to move or expand various programs based on the projected status of the outbreak. Evaluation that we conducted of the tool from multiple stakeholders was positive. The feedback indicated to us that our design was, in fact, an effective representation of their data. And yet, we noticed a hesitation by our collaborators to actually embrace the new tool for their actual analysis. So we started probing their reluctance, and we were able to confirm that even though the tool was a good reflection of the Zika data, the data itself was not an accurate reflection of what the experts knew to be true about the outbreak in the region. Now, this came up one of the first times in a discussion we had when we showed some collaborators a choropleth of Zika case data at the national level. So what we're looking at here, Brazil was shown in dark red, indicating it had a relatively high percentage of Zika cases, whereas Colombia was a much lighter orange, indicating a lower percentage. In discussing these maps, one of our collaborators noted to us that while Brazil reports all cases, Colombia runs a full investigation before making any reports. So the implication here is that the difference in how these two countries are reporting on Zika cases results in an aggregated data that presents an inaccurate and possibly misleading picture about the situation on the ground. As we pivoted to focus on this problem, we ended up discovering something really interesting about these experts' relationship with their data. Namely, that although the data was littered with discrepancies like this, these experts had very deep and intimate knowledge about these errors and where they stemmed from. In the case of Zika data, the discrepancies came from the fact that the underlying data is collected, processed, and reported in different ways. This distributed, heterogeneous data generation pipeline is implemented in a different way in every single country. And this leaves a data set with subtle variations in how the underlying data was generated and processed, the vast majority of which go undocumented and unaccounted for. So each country's data generation pipeline is actually shaped by its local political, cultural, economic, geographic, and demographic context, and results in discrepancies like this. The union in region X goes on strike often and doesn't report Zika data. Or country Y recently overhauled its surveillance system, leading to a sudden increase in detected cases. And so, in reflecting on these sorts of discrepancies, we theorized around this and developed a concept that we called implicit error. Now, we define implicit error as measurement error that is inherent to a given data set, assumed to be present and prevalent, but not explicitly defined or accounted for. We ended up developing a characterizing description of implicit error, as well as a process model that describes how implicit error can be externalized and captured in a visualization tool. Now, although our work in this area was grounded in our design study with Zika experts, we speculate that implicit error is prevalent in many other fields. For example, I've worked a lot with air quality experts, and I've literally heard them say, well, I have to calibrate that bit of data because it was measured with this sensor different than how I'm going to calibrate data measured with this sensor, and they do these sorts of things in their head. I've also seen this a lot in biology, where people are using data generated in many different labs, and they do so with varying levels of trust based upon what they know about the work processes and ethics in the various labs. So we really hope that this work is a first step towards building tools that can help deal with implicit errors in many fields. Okay, but stepping back a bit, I want to comment on this design study in the context of the other design studies that I've been part of. And this result here, which is potentially a very general insight about current challenges in data analysis, is in some ways very far removed from a new visualization technique. In essence, what we did is we were able to use visualization to probe into the relationship of people and their data and to learn something about this. And I personally believe that this learning is going to become a very common way that visualization researchers can make an impact in the world in the future. Now, to get to this kind of insight, and again, an insight that is different and more fundamental than the design of a new visualization tool, Nina and I actively experimented with new ways to conduct design studies. And in particular, we reflected on our experience of working with that poetry collaboration to identify the things we wished we had done differently. Some of the tweaks to our methods include taking extensive and reflective field notes throughout the process with an eye towards recording things that were surprising or unexpected to us. We also explicitly use visualization prototypes as technology probes to better understand the domain expert's analysis challenge. Now, this approach required us to put aside concerns when our design requirements pointed to standard visualization designs, as opposed to trying to come up with new and exciting visualization techniques. And finally, we were really sensitive to failures. When our attempts at deployment with our collaborators failed, we used this as an opportunity to dig deeper and reflect on where and why did things go wrong. And this digging is what pointed us to some very interesting relationships about data and these analysts that ended up being the core contribution. At the time when we wrote up this design study, instead we devoted 30% of our paper to describing our design process, as opposed to the visualization tools. And specifically, we discussed in great detail the research and design stages we went through, the participants, the different methods we employed, the technology probes we designed, and the learning and insights that we acquired through a reflective process. Now, reflection as a research method became the backbone of our analysis. But even this was an interesting insight for us, specifically the importance of reflection in conducting design studies and the general lack of actionable guidance in the visualization community for how to do it. This then has led to some recently published work with my colleague Jason Dykes to begin to understand the role of reflection in applied visualization research. We've come to really learn that there's very little consensus in the visualization community about how to reflect, what to record to support reflection, and how we should be reporting on insights that emerge from a reflective process. How to use reflection as a research method, I think, is an interesting open question right now, and one that we believe has important implications for producing trustworthy and general knowledge from visualization design work. So that was in just wrapping up this notion that for the poets and for us, the tool we created was not the most interesting thing that came from those collaborations. And that's something that I'm seeing again and again as the notion of design studies evolves in our community. Now, these 3 points, none of them, as I said, none of them are unique to working with poets or humanists more generally. But I really felt that they were particularly poignant in our digital humanities project and really gave me a place to reflect upon and to think about as my research moved forward. So, before I end this talk, I wanted to sort of leave with this notion of why, as a computer scientist, do I think it's really valuable to work with humanists? And so, I see, maybe this is really obvious to most of you, but from my perspective, besides being just a lot of fun, I think there were some things that humanists specifically afforded computational research. First, the role of technology is unclear for many areas of humanities, such as in close reading. Even defining what data is an open question. This gives us, as technologists, an opportunity to explore, to play, and to experiment, and to look for how things that we make disrupts what humanists do. And I think that if we can be comfortable in not knowing the path forward in a digital humanities project, we can be sensitive to the things that surprise us and push us. I think these sorts of collaborations can lead to deep insights about visualization and the role of data in our lives. Additionally, humanists are deeply creative and reflective researchers, which I'd argue are 2 really important characteristics for the kind of applied visualization research that we conduct. And I believe that there's a lot that we can learn from humanists about their practices, and hopefully transfer to what we do in similarly creative and reflective computer science research. And so with that, this is just, of course, the slide that acknowledges all the amazing, amazing people I've had the opportunity to work with. I really appreciate your attention. I'd be happy to take any questions.